Welcome to the Gottesdienst crowd, where we foster confessional integrity, liturgical preservation, and preaching that doesn't stink. We believe that the historic liturgy of the divine service is more than mere cobwebs of antiquity, but it is a true treasure of the Church to be dusted off and brought down from her attic to be enjoyed. So let's get dusting.
Welcome back to the Gottesdienst crowd. This is Jason Braaten. Today we have with us for the first time Paul Schulz. He is the pastor of Trinity Lutheran Church in Mallard, Iowa, and Zion Lutheran Church in Ayrshire, or is it Ayrshire?
Mostly we just go with Ayrshire.
Okay, Ayrshire, Iowa. So welcome for the first time, Paul.
Thank you very much. It's great to be on.
So you are a contributor to the recently released Festschrift in honor of John Stephenson, one of our bloggers and editors, servant of Christ Church. We've already had a chance to talk to Fritz Eckert as well as Stephen Preuss about their contributions. And so now, today I wanted to talk about yours. The title is, cleverly compiled, Familiarity Breeds Contemplation, an historical and practical examination of fixed liturgical rites. So I'm curious, before we kind of launch into why you, or what you found in your research, why this topic? What are you seeing where you're serving, and just in the Church in general and at large, that a discussion or a refamiliarizing ourselves with fixed liturgical texts is so important and needed in our day?
Yeah, so it's not really, it's only a specific interest of mine, probably in the past 5 or 10 years, but looking back when I was doing the research, I realized I've kind of been interested in this topic as long as I can remember. I had a bit of a unique childhood, and my dad was invited to preach around most of the Missouri Synod. And being an only kid, he usually dragged me along, so I got to see the wide variety of Sunday morning services in the LCMS. And when you're a kid, right, you just assume that the institutions or the people in charge are kind of they've got it all figured out. And then you kind of realize as you get a little older that not everybody has it figured out. And just the variety, and nobody could ever really explain to me the theological reason for the variety. So I started asking before I went to seminary, why do you do this? Or why do you do this? Or why do you not do this? And what I've learned, and I've especially been asking this in the past couple of years, is that not a lot of reasoning for what people might do on Sunday morning that isn't necessarily strictly commanded in the scriptures. Their reasoning is not usually all that theological, and usually much more sort of community practical, for a lack of a better word, if that makes sense. So I was just interested to see how we got to this point. And I know that Walther complains that this wasn't good in his day, and Lochner complains that it wasn't good in his day, but even if it's a constant complaint, it's still something to look at and wonder why.
Yeah. In other words, perhaps the slippery slope isn't always a fallacy.
Yeah, no, I really don't think that it is. I mean, so that's just
when you were traveling with your dad, so what kind of conversations would ensue after the fact? What were the discussions like with him when you discussed these things on your return trips?
Interesting. My dad was a graduate of Springfield in the late 60s. And so liturgical education at that time was, as I heard from someone who went there in the same generation, it was relatively limited to something along the lines of about the last 2 weeks before you would get your call. The president would kind of take you through, like, now you face this way, now you face this way, like practice chanting a bit. And there really wasn't that much. So he and I would both kind of wonder, basically, about where did they get that from? Or as he kind of humorously texted me yesterday about a situation I observed recently, he said, well, the first thing you have to remember in the LCMS is that with God, all things are possible. So, let the reader understand. So,
Yeah, good.
Yeah. So that's kind of where we're at. I mean, we'd talk about it, but it was kind of like, what do you do? It's not your parish, and it's never good to go away from a parish just complaining about everything that's wrong when you visit. I mean, you never know the situation there. You never know what the pastor's dealing with. So,
no, that is a good point, to not be completely black-pilled on all these things. So familiarity breeds contemplation. Now, why do you say that?
So I did not. I like that you said that it was clever. I can't claim it by any means. I have here the latest Logia issue, actually, on the Formula Missae. And in Stephenson's article, he says where he got the term. And he kind of kept repeating it to me throughout seminary. He always wanted me to write a paper about it, seemingly. Professors do that. They want something researched, but they don't want to do it. So they just tell a kid to do it. But he says, I am grateful to the unnamed scholar for his phrase, familiarity breeds contemplation. And apparently it was one of his tutors at Oxford. So that's where the cleverness comes from. Okay. But, right. So it's a play on the common phrase, familiarity breeds contempt, which is somehow how, if you do the same service every Sunday, it ends up, seeming for some people that they really just hate it. But instead, when you realize that the and we'll get to a definition of what I mean by rite here soon, because it is pretty specific, and that will keep some people hopefully from getting offended. But when you realize that the rites that we have, historically given, right, not necessarily scripturally commanded, but historically given and handed down, they're all God's word. So I don't know. I don't feel comfortable saying, well, we shouldn't repeat it too much. Seems like a dangerous thing to say. Yeah. And that's how I began the article. Is Valerius Herberger, who I'm sure a great Reformation preacher. He talks about how ministers are commanded to required to repeat the same teaching many times, according to Philippians 3:1, that good things cannot be spoken of too much, and a good song should be sung thrice. And I vaguely remember a story, maybe it was one of you Gottesdienst guys, about somebody he knew that his congregation didn't like the good Orthodox hymns. So when they wouldn't sing loud enough, he'd get up and say, that was a good one, let's sing it again. And they would. I forget who that was, but when people complain about repeating the holy things too often, that's not a reflection on the holy things,
Right. Yeah, we could use a bit more Ernie Banks in our approach to things. It's a beautiful day. Let's play too. And often our own attitudes end up playing into how our people perceive these things as well. And so really we are given to have a joyfulness about it before they are.
Well, and one thing I was talking to one of my closest brothers in the ministry about a couple months back is that I was rereading the introduction to Pelikan's 5-volume history, and he points out in there quite astutely that the first third of the Christian church theology was done by the bishops, the second third by the monks, and the third third by the academics. And you notice in that progression that the people doing the theology become less and less involved in the public worship service. Right? You move from bishops to monks. And again, I have to speak generally because it's such a wide claim. But, you move more into the monastery, and then from the monastery, at least you're praying there. But then you move to the academics. And as a dear friend recently sent me a message and said, there's sometimes a special place for academics in Hades, because because they're completely disconnected from the life that is supposed to come out of the words that they are commenting on.
Yeah.
And I mean, this happens to me, and maybe it's just because I'm not always the brightest bulb in the box. But like just this past, Thursday, right? Ascension. We were singing the Gloria. Man, I've been singing that same Gloria for 30 years now.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't realize it explains the Ascension in there. That the Ascension is where we get the mercy from.
Mm-hmm.
But if I hadn't have had that there, and had that deep in me, I don't know if I would have recognized that so clearly. So, there's a lot to contemplate. And when it's even in the collect, right? Read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest. That's the same thing. It's in our prayers.
Mm-hmm. So, surveying history, then, why are the rites of the church so important? Where do they? It seems like it's where the rubber hits the road, where theology becomes immediately practical. But perhaps there's more there.
Yeah, let me just look up something here. There's this wonderful book. One of your editors has referenced it before on the blog, called Lutherans and Calvinists in the Age of Confessionalism, by a man named Bodo Nischan, Nischan. And it's not cheap if you can even find a copy. But I did have a copy given to me, and it's just wonderful. So it's the time period when the people were really working out the Reformation. And he's got this sentence in here about the Fractio Panis, right? The Reformed or the Calvinist breaking of the wafer to prove that Christ isn't there. And he says, Lutherans rejected the fraction, Calvinists insisted on it, at a time when both Lutherans and Calvinists were using similar or identical language with different meanings to describe the sacrament. Specific liturgical practices, such as the breaking of the bread, came to symbolize basic theological disagreements that otherwise were not apparent. And one of the points he makes throughout the book is that the purpose of not just reverent, but very purposeful rites is for the sake of the people who don't have either sometimes the ability, most often just simply don't have the time, or they aren't given the vocation of studying theology like pastors are. And so it's basically your quick and dirty way to communicate, this is what we believe. So like when you do this, right? I mean, going back to the example from earlier, which way do you face? When you face the altar, it's on behalf of the people, right? The people to God. When you face the other way, it's God to the people. Well, I mean, the service works if you don't make that differentiation, but it works better if you do.
Correct.
So all of these things are, and you get this. I mean, any pastor who's taken a call to a parish they weren't previously at knows this. You show up, you do something, and then somebody asks you, "Oh, why'd you do that?"
Yeah.
Well, do you have an explanation or not? So the other things that they would fight about during that time, I mean, he's got great stories in here. There's this guy that he was just a simple butcher, but the Calvinists rejected that anything really spiritual was happening in baptism. It was an outward symbol of involvement in the church. So they they did not do an exorcism. They refused. And they refused to do private baptisms because if the point is to introduce the kid to your church, does that sound familiar? Then it can only happen in the public assembly. So he's got this story about this butcher, and this butcher's got a few daughters who need to be baptized, and the butcher's Lutheran, and they suspect the pastor of being a Calvinist. So the butcher says, "You will be baptizing my children with the Lutheran rite." And when he came for the baptism, he brought his cleaver to make sure that the exorcism was performed. Right? So somebody was going to be cast out either way. Let's just make sure it's Satan.
Yeah.
So, these are things that the lay people, they have, it really is all about the lay people. And we'll get to that in Gerhardt.
Yeah. So it seems, if I'm hearing you right, like the choice is not whether you're going to have ritual or not have ritual. The choice is whether that ritual is going to bear any resemblance to what you actually believe and teach and confess. And And we should be cognizant of that because, as the Augsburg Confession indicates, we retain these things in order that the people may be instructed, discipled, as it were, instructed in what they need to know about Christ.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think before we go forward, we should really define what we mean by rite, because it's a little bit more specific than ritual, at least in the way I'm using it. And if I remember correctly, I do think I took time to explain this in the paper, but it is in the New Companion to the Services volume of Lutheran Service book. It's on page 18, and Dr. Winger has included he always has a little some sort of visualization, and so the rite is distinguished from liturgy and ceremony. So confessionally speaking, when you do the liturgy, it's not setting three. Like setting three is the specific form of the liturgy that you do, but the liturgy is the giving of the word in the sacrament, and kind of, I don't want to say abstract, but like the theological essential core of it. But the rite is sort of the set outward visible form, and then the ceremony is like the decorations, right? So like the Christmas tree represents Christmas, that's liturgy, and then the tree is the rite, and the ceremony is the decorations or something. And we are scripturally bound. This he has it laid out like a continuum. So liturgy is on the left. This is unchangeable, divinely commanded. It requires our fidelity. And on the far right is ceremony, which is totally human decision, and everything there should be done with charity. But right in the middle is the rite, which is he says we need discernment instead of charity here, and that is true, right? I mean, all of Luther's liturgical forms were just wise discernment. They weren't whole cloth new creations or anything,
right?
But I specifically in my paper limit the discussion of fixed and repetitive rites to the text of the service. And in doing that, I was kind of taking the lead of the Lutheran Liturgical Association, who produced the Common Service. And the Common Service, properly speaking, is only the text of what the Sunday morning service, the Divine Service, the Matins and Vespers, right?
Yes.
And then we have multiple musical settings. So
and that's typically how I've spoken about it as well with my people, and even among the editors here at Gottesdienst is, we distinguish rite from the adornments of that rite, whether it's ceremonies or musical setting, just by what is actually said. Not what is done, right. What is said. And then you can have, even in the adornments, better or worse, so to speak.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's,
yeah. So you're limiting in your discussion here of rite to what is actually said. So I'm going to use something concrete here. So if we're doing page 15, you mean the wording of the Gloria, the wording of the Nunc Dimittis, the wording of the words of institution, everything that is printed.
the ordinaries and the responses.
Yeah.
All that.
Yeah. So. And to limit the words, the rite there, to a single standard that aids in memory and as well as contemplation, then. Is that?
Yeah. So I kind of started off my argumentation with the syllogism. And the first syllogism is that that you were supposed to bring the faithful into a supremely personal union with Christ. And this comes from the New Testament specific definition of disciple, of mathetes. The TDNT says it's just got this unique meaning in the New Testament that it doesn't have in the rest of Greek, but the general meaning, of course, right, is that you're learning, and that as we learn about Christ, we are brought closer to him. It's not knowledge that provides salvation, it's faith, but these things are intimately and necessarily related. And so the syllogism one is that, or line one of the syllogism, I should say, would be that that we are supposed to make disciples, make mathetes, make people who learn and inwardly digest all this knowledge about their Savior. And then, just kind of the general observable truth that we all have heard, that repetition is the mother of all learning. So if you want to learn, you have to repeat it. Therefore, all the disciples should be repeating things very, very frequently. And I know that this probably would make more sense if it were applied strictly to catechism class or something. But the fact of the matter is that Luther didn't really treat, the catechism and the hymnal all that differently in terms of these texts. One of the things, people could go look up in volume 53 is Luther had to write all these, volume 53 of Luther's works. Luther had to write all these introductions to hymnals, and his frustration time after time was like, quit changing these things, right? I think I've heard you talk about this, but I've done this in my Bible class a couple times, going through the catechism and stuff. Well, let's all recite it together. Well, you've got 3 generations in a room, and now they all know different versions. It's all, and everybody laughed, and I didn't have to write an essay. They saw the point right away. I said, we should all be saying the same words. So,
yeah. Well, I mean, I still have folks who refuse to say the creeds in the updated language.
Yeah.
So that's how they learned it.
Yep. So that's kind of the thing, is just that creating disciples happens logically through repetition. That was the basis for me to get back in. I wanted to make it more of a historical study, but so I was hoping it would be longer too. I had other things, but mostly I ended up in Gerhardt, and he starts in an interesting place. So I'm looking at I have his 2 theological commonplaces. What is this? 26 version 1 and 26:2. So it's on the ministry. It's a wonderful pair of books. You should all buy them. But to begin speaking about the duties of the pastors, of the office of the ministry, he doesn't go to 1 Timothy like we probably would, right? He takes a much, much wider view. So he explains that he begins in heaven, actually, which I thought was genius. So he says, among the holy angels who are involved in constant warfare against the dragon of hell and his angels, orders were divinely established. For this reason, the apostle distributes the invisible things into heaven, into thrones and dominions and principalities and so on. And so he then says, so also here on earth in the church militant, which is a copy of the church triumphant, orders have in the same way been defined by God. And this is where he gets, right, the definition of the church, the office of the ministry, all this sort of stuff. And for the first time in my life, I saw somebody speak about ecclesiology from Song of Songs. And he did, because I guess Song of Songs talks about a terribly ordered battle line. And that's what Gerhardt warns against. So this repetition of rite for Gerhardt is nothing more than making sure your militant army of the church, right? Not in not in some of the ways that people talk about that, but rather in the biblical way of speaking about the battle that's going on, that we need to be well ordered, because, in military history, where most people die in a battle is not the battle. It's in what's called the rout, the ROUT. So when you're when the enemy gets a slight advantage on you and your ranks break, then they overwhelm and they kill all your people because you're disordered. You can't take a stand. That's where most battle casualties come from in a lot of major battles, probably pre-1950 or something.
Yeah. Does Chemnitz, Gerhard, Is
Yeah.
Gerhard operating under the understanding that of the hoplite phalanx here, that ordered, that everyone has sort of the same weaponry and the same tactics moving forward, and they're operating as one unit against a common enemy?
Yeah, I mean, so he gets there. I mean, it takes him till volume 2 to describe the specific duties of the ministry. He begins with the 3 estates. So, kind of defining, well, what's the church here to do? What is the church's vocation? And so he ends up in volume 2. I guess we'll just go ahead to that. He ends up getting. Let me find it here. He lists the 5 duties of ministers under the papacy, which is to offer sacrifices, to preside, though he points out not in the apostolic sense, that they are supposed to bless, they are to baptize, they are to preach, even though none of them preach, and that's it. But then, let me see if I can find my page here. The duties of the ministers in the Lutheran Church, he gives as 7, probably intentionally. So you have preaching the word, dispensing the sacraments, right? We're all on board already. Praying for the flock committed to them. I know you've written a lot about that before. The honorable governance of behavior and life. Chemnitz, I'm not sure would be on the call list for a certain amount of American Lutheran churches.
Yeah.
Because he says that a minister who misbehaves destroys the gospel. I mean, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but he can actually prevent people from coming to faith through public action. 5, administration of church discipline, right? Something we usually leave to the other Protestants as like a mark of the church or duties of the ministers. Then I'm going to skip 6 and head to 7, the care of the poor and the visitation of the sick. Okay, well, most of us do that. And then number 6, he specifically lists the preservation of ecclesiastical rituals. And he's got plenty of reasoning for it. But I thought it was interesting that it wasn't listed. It's not like he had a list of essential duties and adiaphora duties or something, or like however you would divide that up. This is an essential duty, according to Gerhard, of the ministers of the church. Now, just to be clear, before you get 1,000 emails about how you're a sacerdotalist and you shouldn't have a sacerdotalist like me on, he is very clear that the rites belong to the church. The institution of the rites belongs not to ministers alone, but to the Christian magistrate. Well, it'd be nice to have one. And it ought to be done with the consent of the whole church. So, I mean, I guess for us, that would be synodical approval would be the closest. Right. And we've always had that in the LCMS, whether we enforce it or not, that you're supposed to use approved rites, approved hymnals, approved worship resources. Now, he does make a distinction, though, between to whom does the whole thing belong and whose duty is it to take care of it? Because the duty of the preservation of the rites is assigned to the ministers. Now,
so you're saying
I mean,
the
like
rites themselves belong to the whole church, including the magistrates and the people, but the duty to preserve them is given to the minister himself.
Yeah. And not by the consent of the governed, let the reader understand. Although, we can talk about that too if we need to. Obviously I guess the consent of the whole church, but it seems like he's sort of expecting, a lot more conservatism than maybe we're used to in some areas.
Yeah.
But anyway, so why do they have to do this? What is the goal of preserving these rites? It's not some sort of liturgical repristination, right? Like we see in some churches that like totally give up doctrine, but man, do they have pretty copes and fancy candles and stuff. So it's not that. It's not just to do it. He says church rituals by nature are adiaphora. They do not themselves constitute a part of divine worship. And this is interesting, right next to the word adiaphora. Nevertheless, they should not be cut short or abrogated merely by one part of the church. So you can't have, and I don't know if he means here regional part or if he means like clergy or laity as each being parts.
Okay.
But either way, nobody is given a right to change the rite, just in their place or in their own time. So what's the risk? You were going to say something.
So is Gerhard operating with just a slightly larger understanding of rite than how you are?
I would say yes, and I just limited myself so as to not. I didn't want people to think I was just commenting on, a specific hymnal or something.
Yeah. So to kind of put your argument into context, if Gerhard includes more to what the definition of rite is, surely your definition of less of what rite is included.
Yeah, that was my goal. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Argue from a conservative position.
Yeah.
So, but what I found interesting, because let's be honest, the worship wars died like 15, 20 years ago. Like the battle lines are set so well that the fortresses are just super well built. The fighting over this has largely died out. But we all remember and know very well, at least in the LCMS, the language that each side used in these battles, different language at different times. So it's interesting to see the language that Gerhard uses and which side he falls on. So he says that if you take it upon yourself as a minister or a congregation or a regional area to just change the rites of the church, right, to change the language or the definition behind the language, right, that's usually our argument, that it is a sin against Christian freedom to do this. It is a sin against Christian love. And I've seen this happen on both sides. Both sides of the worship divide, that people absolutely forget that this must be done with the care of the other person in mind, because we're giving the medicine of immortality through it, right? The rite is not the medicine, but you want your medicine to come in a prescription bottle that's kind of like, it's got the little white cap and it's got the instructions on the side.
Right.
The container doesn't save you, but man, does it help out with the medicine.
Yeah.
And that this is how we show love, and that they should, he notes that they should be very careful not to cause a neighbor to stumble by the preposterous use of adiaphora. You should, write that on a note card and pull it out anytime somebody uses the word adiaphora.
Yeah. Well, it seems like, so as you mentioned already, I mean, I can remember the form of the arguments, the language used in the arguments during the worship wars. And it was always about, these things are adiaphora and we are free. And it sounds like what Gerhard is saying is actually that's a sin against Christian freedom when you begin to make freedom the deciding factor. Well,
freedom for who is always the question, right? Is it freedom to do what I want? Because that would be very, that just fits in with Augustine's man curved in on himself thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not.
I'm the spirit of our age.
You know this, right? How long have you been a pastor again?
16 years.
Yeah. So you know that often, when you quote, love your people, it almost always involves you as a minister putting aside your own desires in the situation almost completely, mostly for the good, for their good. Right. So, yeah. I mean, hypothetically, in this whole rite discussion, it could be possible that according to Gerhard and Chemnitz and the rest of church history's, general opinion, it could be possible to do a different musical and text setting every Sunday, right? If you have a congregation where everybody's taken Liturgics 1 and Liturgics 2, you could do it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I still wouldn't probably, based on what I've come to after this research.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is this, that our congregations are not filled with those. I don't think anybody has a congregation like that.
Yeah.
I remember one of the things that really helped me. So this is what I've been doing at my parish for 6 years is, common service. That's it. And the amount of people who have thanked me because they can't really read and they don't want to, not ability to read, but like their eyes have gone bad, or maybe they can't hear well, right? They can fully participate in the service without having to, look like their eyes don't work anymore. Or, I have 2 children. My daughter just turned 5. She's been singing the entire liturgy in the front row for at least a year and a half.
Yeah.
Right. She's just now getting to read full sentences. So, that when we want to talk about Christian love, let's actually look at who the others. Yeah, I don't like that word. Let's immediately look at the flock that we have been given and see if are there people who are capable of handling constant variation.
Yeah.
One of your former editors wrote about this because he's the one that kind of convinced me to do this. Pastor Ball, he wrote a blog post a long time ago about they have I forget the details, some mentally challenged kid in the congregation, and he sings all the pastor's parts, right? It's not appropriate for anyone else to do, but this kid, he knows the whole liturgy. He has all the gifts of God deeply ingrained into his heart. Why remove that by constant confusion?
Yeah.
I mean, like I've been to churches. One of the things that I do remember that I wasn't able to block from my memory, we went to one and we did like the Kyrie from setting 1, the Gloria from setting 2, the Agnus Dei from setting 3. And it was, my dad's a pastor and he's been around a while, right? He turns, I think, like 79 this year. And he walks out of services all the time. And he's like, I couldn't tell where we are, what we were doing, which page we were on. It's not that hard to keep. Yeah. We'll talk about the benefits of it at the end, but
yeah. So this really goes back to your point that I think you quoted from Winger about, so even though it might be possible, the question is not possibility, but discernment on what is actually beneficial. It kind of goes to the Corinthians argument that Paul makes time and time again. All things are lawful, but not all things are profitable. Not all things build up. And are we actually building up, or are we just causing confusion?
Well, and another thing that I've noticed by asking people about why they do certain things, and again, like different practices don't offend me. I'm totally for the idea of like the pre-Reformation regional rites, right? You had like the Gallican rite. I'm not as much of a liturgy nerd as some of the people listening, so don't send me an angry email because I got one wrong. But you had regional rites. Wouldn't it be interesting if we had like it would be interesting if we have like a Northwest service and an Iowa service. And I think somebody came up with an Iowa service once, printed it out, but we won't talk about that. But I think it's interesting. Gerhardt says that the result of all of this is that the ministers of the church. Now, does this sound like Synod Convention language? I don't think so. The rule of this is that the ministers of the church should not yield even for an hour to enemies of the truth who push for the introduction or abrogation of a rite in the church, because they don't want Christian liberty to be subjected to the desires of their adversaries. Now, just to be clear, I am not saying that several different rites in the hymnal is the evidence of adversaries coming in trying to teach false theology. But you can clearly see from those examples from Bodo Nishon that when you have all these different things, the lay people get confused Are these the same things, or are they not?
Mm-hmm.
And especially when you go outside of the approved sources.
Yeah. So it's not necessarily evidence of it, but it could be.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And right. I got to stop using the word right. How do I say this? I'll think about that one, and then let's move on.
Okay. So the result is that ministers should not yield in these matters, but hold the line for the sake of actual Christian freedom, as well as the building up of the people. How does this play out then in the actual church orders? I mean, what do we see when a guy like Chemnitz or Gerhard puts one
in
together?
Chemnitz?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it has been a while since I totally went through Chemnitz's agenda, but I do have it here. I mean, he's got set. He has all the texts. Like, here's the text you use. He even includes music. It's what I have found just with this, church order here in my hand of Chemnitz. What I have found is that I think that a lot of laity in the LCMS assume that we have a church order.
Yeah.
Because how many times do people come to you and they say, Pastor, how do you do this? And in your mind, that this is something that like every parish does differently.
Yeah. No, I think you're right about that. I think they assume that we are more orderly than we actually are on paper, right?
Yeah. Well, I mean, as orderly as we should be, I think.
Yeah.
Disorder has this effect, and lex orandi, lex credendi goes both ways, right? So when you introduce variation, it can be very faithful among the generation that introduces it, right? But if the generation that follows doesn't understand how to use this variation, they might end up with theological and not just practice variation.
But that's a really good point, I think, that needs to be explored. That
I have this.
One generation.
I have a real quick example.
Yeah.
I was, through this, I was also reading a bunch in, 1800s era pastoral theologies and stuff, which is a different discussion for a different time. But, when you do that, you want to see, what do these people look like? Well, then you go back, and this is going to sound like it's not related, but I think it is a little bit. Back in this era, when all the men dressed the same, their personalities were much more obvious. Like, you go back and you read these guys in the 1800s, it's like hanging out with a friend. Like, you can tell what bothers them and what they don't care about and what their weird idiosyncrasies are.
Yeah.
The commonality of form brings out the personality and the individuality of the individual and sets that out there. And our congregations, I have two, and I've talked to several other guys with multi-point parishes. And, it's some days it's like dating two women at once. They're totally different. So if we do the rites the same, then the congregations can actually be more individual, and their own personal strengths and weaknesses come to the fore, which makes it easier for everybody to plan and to get stuff done.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because then you know who you're working with.
Yeah. It sort of acts like salt when it's used properly. Okay. So what are the modern examples? I mean, we've kind of built up from
Gerhard,
from Gerhard, and then a little bit about Chemnitz. How does this work itself out in what we currently have, LSB, and then perhaps other newer hymnals?
Yeah. So, I went back and I looked at a lot of the minutes from the meetings for the creation of LSB. Part of which I even personally remember. I grew up in St. Louis, and so we weren't far from the headquarters at the time. And the congregation I grew up in was TLH 5 and 15. First and third Sundays communion, second and fourth Sundays matins. with like confession and absolution added, right?
Mm-hmm.
Unique, not unique in the LCMS, but it's certainly a variation on the intent of the hymnal. But we were heavily field tested for the Lutheran service book, and I was musically inclined at the time, so I liked it. I enjoyed it. But all the variation, the interestingness of the variation disappeared when we would get back into the regular ritual of the common service. Now, in the minutes for the LSB, at the very first meeting, from what I can tell, there were a couple people that said we can have different settings, but we need to have the same rite, as in different musical settings. So, I don't really know what the conversations about definitions of words were with the LSB. According to my definition I've been working with, that we've been talking about, we would have 4 settings of the divine service in the LSB? Or sorry, four rites. And one rite has 2 settings. So that would be 1 and 2. And then setting 3, which is, the kind of recension of the common service. And then 4, which was new for the hymnal, and 5, which, as printed is not really usable for a congregation. So I don't know if it really matters, but we have 4 rites in the hymnal, and that's fine. Just, pick one and go with it. But I did think that it was interesting that people did suggest that at the very beginning, that we should have the same text. There was discussion as to whether or not they should just reprint the TLH and just put new hymns in, or rather old hymns that are, updated. Yeah. So that conversation was there. From what I remember, there was, they field tested 3 settings. They called them X, Y, and Z. And I think those shared the same text. And from what I recall, it was kind of an amalgamation between the common service and some more modern updates. So they had the ability to have the same rite with different musical settings, and didn't choose to go with it, and we have what we have, and you can absolutely use it faithfully, and do what you need to do.
It would have been difficult to after having a number of years with Lutheran Worship LW, it would have been difficult to have excised what is now in LSB settings 1 and 2. There were congregations that lived by that.
There is a giant underlying theological thing to deal with here that I've been working on in my spare time and trying to figure out and talk with other people about, and we have absolutely not nearly enough time to talk about it right now. But this ultimately comes down confessionally to a 4th commandment issue. Because the Augsburg, was it 24, that we retain the rites and ceremonies and the lectionaries and the vestments and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Why? Because that's what the church gave to us, right? The church, as our mother, handed it over as a tradition. Well, what do you do when your immediate fathers in the faith handed down something different than what was handed down to the church in the time of the confessions? Yeah. 4th commandmently, which one takes precedence? Does it matter? Do you go, do we read this like the Quran, where the most recent is the most authoritative? Well, it's interesting because if you pay attention to people arguing about the liturgy and stuff online, which usually means nothing, if you pay attention to how they talk, everybody's kind of got a different place where they set their 4th commandment authority. Yeah. And then they follow that. So I'm still trying to figure it out myself. I'm pretty much just stuck on the fact that I have seen it in actual practice work out, that you just pick one setting for your congregation and stick with it. And it brings out, this is the beautiful part. First of all, you can actually look people in the eye when you're conducting the service. Mm-hmm. And you're not, you realize how it looks when, I don't know, it always looked like this to me growing up when the pastor was leading the service out of the hymnal. I was like, does he not know? Like, does he not have the one thing that he has to do every week memorized by now? You know, you're blessing people with God's words if you can't take the time to memorize these, and if you're just reading it, it is still effective by all means, but you know, it just kind of looks like we're not all the way there yet.
Yeah, no, I hear you. That was one of the first things I set out to do, was to memorize the parts that I'm actually speaking to them.
Well, I mean, for me, you know, you realize very quickly in the ministry that very little of your job is predictable,
right?
Except for the Sunday morning service. So let's keep it predictable. Now the other thing is that the ordinaries, as beautiful and theologically rich as they essentially, you know, by essence are by being words of Scripture, they also, when they're regular and when people have them memorized and inwardly digested, they create what like maybe a graphic designer would call like negative space. And it doesn't mean that they go away, but the life within the church that happens, you know, in the church year through the propers and all this stuff and the preaching, that becomes even more distinct because that is changing. And so then you can learn to pay attention to the constants. I preached on this a little bit yesterday morning for, you know, Waiting Sunday, Easter 7 or Ascension 1, whatever you want to call it. You know, the church is best served by changing as little as possible because the world tries to change all the time, constantly in search of new passions and lusts.
Yeah.
So let's be a little bit regular and stable. Plus then, you know what, if you do this over a long enough period, you get the people who kind of go away from church for a while and then they come back. One of the great parts about the historic Western liturgy, when it's done reverently, and by reverently, I don't mean like overdone, just like you can tell that the pastor cares more about God's opinion than the people's.
Yeah.
And people come and they visit, and I've had so many people go, man, it really felt like I was at church.
Yeah.
And I don't press them on that to wonder what what's on the other side of that comment. But it is interesting. Now another interesting thing that I included is that the new Wells hymnal did this.
Mm-hmm.
So I forget what it's called. I think it's Christian worship.
Yeah, I think you're right.
You know, the hymn selection, not great. But they picked one text. They have 3 settings. It's essentially our setting 1 and 2 for the text. And, they just committed to it. It's great. I mean, I'm not saying it's a great hymnal. I haven't looked through all of it. I'm not picky enough like some people to be able to really measure that, but they at least saw this as a historical thing. And I forget, they have an explanation here, if I can find it real quick, about, let's see, the settings of their rites now share the same words. So this is what they say about it. The service is the title we are using for a rite of worship with Holy Communion. A single text is used in each of the 3 settings of the service. Having a single text for the service is intended to foster familiarity with both the words and the flow of the rite. In a short amount of time, all worshipers, young children, non-readers, the visually impaired, etc., can become familiar with the text that carries these timeless truths to the head and to the heart. While the single text of the service fosters familiarity, the different musical settings will provide variety. And again, I think I have a copy, but I haven't sat down and looked at it. You know, maybe it's great, maybe it's not, but at least that sort of philosophy of repetition and deep inward leaning of basic texts is there explicitly.
So familiarity actually helps us and aids us in further contemplation of the mysteries of God set before us week in and week out. If for new pastors, especially during this time of year when a new crop of guys is getting sent out to their spots, what sort of advice or encouragement would you give them to seek to bring wherever they are sent into an understanding of let's not operate in the manner that the world operates, where familiarity breeds contempt, but rather in a space where familiarity breeds contemplation. What sort of things would you tell them to do?
Gosh. Well, I'd say, buy these two books of Gerhardt on the ministry, especially the second one, and just spend some time really looking at those, the duties of the minister and the things that you kind of can and I don't want to say can't compromise, but like don't have the right to change.
Mm-hmm.
That because that'll give you some basis. Don't if you're coming to a parish that does setting one with communion, setting one without communion, setting two with, setting two without, and kind of cycle through everything. I don't know if it's wise to jump all at once. I would, to be honest, Jason, I really don't like questions like this, simply because I see this as, if our seminary education is working as it should, the men who are being approved for ministry should be trusted to have the wisdom to know what the goal is, and the wisdom to be able to read the situation and see, how far away from this goal are you, and what stands in the way.
Yeah,
I mean,
well, I appreciate that. I guess what I was trying to get at is, I mean, not to really put you on the spot, but like, what sort of things did you find helpful in explaining? I mean, oftentimes what I find in talking to other guys, a helpful analogy or helpful ways of explaining why, moving in this direction is so important. Something that perhaps I didn't think of. So in your experience, what have you found helpful in being able to talk about these things so that perhaps if people were, I don't know, pressing back against you to maintain this kind of conservative view of the rite, what do you have found helpful in explaining it to them? Does that make sense?
Yeah. Gosh, this is going to sound like avoiding the question again. I guess really just, personal conversations about what frustrates them about it, and just kind of, walking through what's the service supposed to do? Like not a practical, what do you put in and get out of it, but what's the purpose of the service? And then if you can kind of reorient people to understanding, what the purpose, what the goal, what the most effective, I don't like that term, what the most wise way of going about worship is in your situation, that people can get on board, and, regularity in everything else as well. And I don't mean repetition in everything else, but regularity. If they see that no matter what, no matter how well you are getting along with the parishioner that might be upset with you, if they have a need, like a real spiritual need for a pastor, and you just go, all right, I'm on it, and take care of it, they will start to trust your regularity on Sunday morning. It's really more of a general philosophy of pastoral care is how Gerhardt presents it, and how I've found it to be useful. When I've been relying a lot lately with talking to some people about the office and on those words of Jesus that, my sheep hear my voice. Well, guess what? You're a pastor, and you just got placed, all the guys who just went through call service, all the people who God has now placed under your care, they don't know your voice yet. They don't know how you talk. They don't know how to know when you're being extra serious or extra joking or anything like that, but they'll learn, and they learn from just repeatedly hearing you. And it's the same in the service. So, one example I like to point out is, as you're going through Lent, right? You start with pre-Lent, and you're just removing things all the way. And here, one of the things that I do is that we still sing the ordinaries, but we say all the responses. We cut out as much singing throughout Lent as possible. And finally, then you cut out the Gloria Patri, and you cut out all this stuff. And those last Sundays before Lent, everybody's like, this doesn't feel right. This isn't normal. And it's supposed to not feel right. You're you're doing readings about Jesus being led to be murdered. So, it helps with that, because the regularity 90% of the time helps accentuate that 10% of natural liturgical, I guess I shouldn't call it irregularity, but, the natural seasons of the church year.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your time, Paul, and for this. It was a really delightful read in the Festschrift. If you guys have not picked up your copy of Servant of Christ Church, a Festschrift in honor of John R. Stephenson, please follow the link that'll be provided and pick yours up. Thanks again, and blessings on all your work there in Iowa.
Yeah, God be with you. Maybe I'll see you at Bugenhagen or something.
Definitely, I'm planning to be there, God willing.
Awesome. I'll beat you in softball, so.
We'll see.
Yeah, we will. We will.
All right, you take care, Paul.
See you later.